What's up everyone, it's Q from Retro Q Gaming, and with all the speculation flying around at the moment about the whole Nintendo and them renewing or redoing or re-registering or whatever it is, a trademark for Game Boy, naturally it has a lot of people questioning if we're going to see a Game Boy Classic or a Game Boy Mini or whatever the hell you want to call it. Now, it's important to look at this from a few different ways, and I feel like I throw my 2 cents in on this, hence why I'm making this actual video. But first off, one key thing to remember is what version of the Game Boy will I use? Because would it be feasible, or would it be too restrictive or too cost prohibitive or whatever the hell it is to release only one specific version? Now what I mean by that is, depending on your opinion and depending on what way you look at things, is the Game Boy came in many shapes and forms and underwent many revisions before getting an actual proper successor. Depending on who you ask, the Game Boy lasted all the way up to the Game Boy Advance. I don't agree with that personally. I think there's multiple different revisions and all, and there was a kind of a one major step in between the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance. But the first thing and most important thing to do is look at all the key versions that have to be taken into consideration before we go any further with this. You've got the tried and trusted Game Boy in whatever way, shape or form it came in. You've got the Game Boy Pocket, the Game Boy Light, the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Advance, the Game Boy Micro, and the Game Boy Advance SP. So now that we've seen the three main types of Game Boy, or depending on your opinion and all, but what I consider the three main types of Game Boy, there are a couple of things to take into consideration. One is form factor. So when you look at the original model Game Boys and their revisions with the Game Boy Pocket and the Game Boy Light, they were all the same standard kind of shape and layout. They weren't the same standard size, but you got the general idea. They were kind of the vertical monolith style, portrait style, it would be a better version of it, with the screen up top, and you had your buttons and your D-pad and all underneath. It was the key design when it came to the original Game Boy. When you moved on to what I consider the first proper successor, you have the Game Boy Color. Came in many different colors, but realistically only had one version. It was essentially a smaller version of the existing Game Boy. Just used 2 batteries instead of 4 and had a color screen, and was slightly smaller. Moving on to the Game Boy Advance, they moved for a landscape style one. Of course, it still had the 2 buttons, 4 if you include the start and select button, but this one did add in the L and R buttons as well, which of course continued with the Game Boy Micro. But when it came to the Game Boy Advance SP, I almost forgot the name of it there for a second, they went to the clamshell design that I suppose could be more akin to the original version. When you open it up and fold it out, it still is a portrait shaped one with the buttons and all under the screen, as opposed to the other Game Boy Advance models that had them on the left and right of the screen for the buttons and the D-pad. So anyway, that's all beside the point. The main things to consider when it comes to the Game Boy is, yeah, the Game Boy, at least the original Game Boy, had a pretty big library of games. Now the problem here is, well, realistically this applies to everything. When you look at the library of Game Boy games, you've got some exceptionally high quality titles. However, on the Game Boy, those are pretty few and far between. And then you've got so many different levels under it, ranging from playable to decent to okay to absolute dog shite. And this is something to consider for multiple reasons. Is one, I think to justify the cost, they would need to put in a significant amount of games. I mean, when you look at the NES Classic, we had 30 games. When you look at the SNES Classic, we had 21 games. With something like the Game Boy, I think if they were to just stick with base Game Boy games, they would need to put in a minimum of 50, maybe even more, because these games are extremely simplistic. Granted, NES games were simplistic as it was, but Game Boy games for the most part were even more simplistic than NES games, let alone SNES games. And something else that has to be said for the cost factor of it too is, how would they do the screen? So personally, what I think they would do, when you look at the old dot matrix screens and all of the way back in the day style ones that they did with these, what I think they should do would be put in a small low resolution screen, but keep it limited in the fact of what the colors it could do. I think what they should do is, because depending actually on which model Game Boy you have, at least even in the original ones, you could have two different Game Boys. There was ones that would be kind of a grayscale and black, and there was ones that would be green and black. So I think it should get, if they do it, they should give you the option to switch either between green and black pixels and grey and black pixel. The problem is the inclusion of an LCD screen, despite how low resolution it might actually be, is a bit of a cost factor in there as well. Now, not only that, but that brings us to another deal. How are we going to do this as well? So, battery life. The Game Boy the original Game Boy model was known as a battery hog. Sure, it wasn't a Sega Game Gear, but it required 4 AA batteries versus something like the Game Boy Color, which used 2. Now, having said that, okay, obviously technology has come a long way, and battery capacity and whatever has come a long way. Power efficiency has come a long way. But would they give us a rechargeable battery? Because remember, it's 2017 here. A lot of people, nostalgia only goes so far before it encroaches on convenience. AA batteries were easy to come by back in the 80s, back in the 90s, back in the early 2000s. They're still extremely easy to come by. But it's the convenience factor. When's the last time you bought something that wasn't basically a throwaway product that required multiple batteries, required AA batteries? So if they do go on the lithium-ion battery, rechargeable battery front, which I think they should, to be honest, where's that going to come in price-wise? And then moving on from just sticking with Game Boy games, would they potentially give us Game Boy Color games? Would they give us them in the sense that you can play either regular Game Boy games, obviously, or you could play some Game Boy Color exclusive games, or there's even a few games actually that can be played on the original Game Boy but have advanced and enhanced extra features if you play them on a Game Boy Color. And of course, there are a few games that only run on Game Boy Color that won't run on the original Game Boy. So that would give us a bit more of an option when it comes to it. For example, there's considerably less Game Boy Color exclusive games, so they could put in a decent chunk of the exclusive library, and they could put in a good selection and a good smattering of original Game Boy games. But that brings us back to the screen at the same time. At that point, they'd be putting in a color screen. Nowadays, even in 2017, buying a very basic, cheap color screen would basically be, it probably would be the same cost as buying a basic, cheap monochrome screen, or we'll call it 3-color screen, just in case they're going to flip between green and black and grey and black. So that would be 3. So the point is that they're probably better off including Game Boy games, for the simple reason is they don't require any extra buttons. The original size and shape, not size, why do I keep saying size and shape? The original shape is the same and the original layout is the same. Start and select button, D-pad, A and B. That's it. Doesn't have to worry about anything else like L and R buttons or whatever. However, at that point, we come into the where do you draw the line part of it. And this is why I question if they could possibly include Game Boy Advance games. Would they go with the whole thing and put in Game Boy, Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Color all into one unit? Now, of course, if they did that, they'd have to put on shoulder buttons, because Game Boy Advance games require L and R buttons as well. So how would they work that? Would they stick with the original design? Because the original Game Boy design is far more iconic it's far more iconic and recognizable than something like a Game Boy Advance, which would be the horizontal shape instead of the vertical shape. But I mean, if they're factoring in a color screen as it is, then you're already looking, well, let's get some Game Boy Advance games on here as well. And because Game Boy Advance had some seriously high quality games, between stuff like Fire Emblem, the Mega Man Battle Network games, Golden Sun, Advance Wars. I don't even have to mention Pokemon because that's on all 3 of them really. But the point is that there's a huge library from all 3 of them. Well, 2.5 because Game Boy Advance or Game Boy Color exclusives were a whole much smaller niche market. So how would they do it? Would they put shoulder buttons on the original one? It's hard to say. Personally, I do think that we're going to get a Game Boy Classic. I don't think it'll be a Game Boy Mini because it might be a little bit smaller, but Game Boy Classic would probably be the more accurate version of it. Now, here's the thing. My prediction, when you look at a regular Game Boy or something in the shape of a regular Game Boy, you could technically put on shoulder buttons. Maybe you could put them on the back, under where your fingers would be on the back side as your L and R buttons, something like that. To be honest, I don't think they'd make it as big as a regular Game Boy. I think they'd go with the Game Boy Color size. And of course, I think they'd keep the portrait design for the whole iconic and recognizable thing. But I think if they do this, we will see all three games, all three platforms, you know, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance. I think we'll see all three of them in one. Now, even if they don't, even if they break them up into individual ones, like Game Boy comes out with just Game Boy games, Game Boy Classic comes out, or Game Boy Color Classic just comes out with Game Boy Color games and enhanced Game Boy games. And then you've got Game Boy Advance Classic, which just comes out with Game Boy Advance Classic. All three of those will sell like hotcakes. There's no question about that whatsoever. But Nintendo have a track record of not wanting to do things kind of like more effort and more work and drag it out or whatever. So we'll see how it goes. Personally, I think they'll go with the portrait design with all three platforms all in at once. Maybe like 70 to 100 games. I think on the scale of it, we'll see something like maybe 40% Game Boy games, 40% Game Boy Advance games, and maybe 20% Game Boy Color games. I think that's how it'll be. But here's what, and definitely yes, I would buy not only one of these units if they released it as I predicted in the single form with all three of them. But if they released it with all three separate versions, of course I would buy all three separate versions. So here's my question. In the comment section below, let me know, which version do you think we'll get? How do you think we will see these potential units, these potential classics, these whatever? Will we see them individually? Will we see them all smashed into one? What design would they use? What kind of screen would they use? What kind of battery do you think they use? Or do you think they'll make us use AA batteries? What kind of game selection do you think they'll give us? Do you think they just give us it with just Game Boy games, with Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Color and regular Game Boy games? Or do you think they'd give us with all three of them? Or do you think they'd do all three of them separately? It's a pretty broad question, so throw anything to do with a potential Game Boy Classic, how you think they might do it, how you would prefer they did it, whatever, in the comments section below. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the rest of the videos in my channel.